for reproductive system, we did the male first, then we did the female, and it makes sense once we do the female, then we'll move on to development. So you should know basic male anatomy. Male anatomy, we're gonna have, think of two basic categories. You either have the pathway where sperm is formed, and then the pathway that sperm will travel till it goes out of the body, and then the glandular or duct system that contributes seminal fluid to what's going out of the body. So those are the two kind of general categories. So you have your basic anatomy where you actually have the testes within the scrotal sac, and there's some muscles involved there, the dartus and the cremaster muscle. And then beyond that, we're going to talk about sperm production, which is in the testes, specifically the seminiferous tubules of the testes. If you recall, there's lots of tubules. If you were to do a histological slice of a testes, within the tubules, that's where sperm is made. Outside the tubules, who can tell me the cells that are there and what do they make? They're interstitial cells or Leydig cells, and they make testosterone. I'm going to draw this on the board here. So if we have a cross section of several seminiferous tubules, markers are getting bad. The Leydig cells, I'm going to put little, I should make circles, makes them look like they're tubules. The Leydig cells are in the little cells out here, I'm making L's for them, and they make testosterone. It's from Leydig cells. How do we get testosterone? Is luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Tells the Leydig cells, actually I should, tells the Leydig cells, and it's the Leydig cells that are going to make testosterone. That's really how it goes there. Then we have the spermatogonia. The cells in the outer periphery of the seminiferous tubules are sort of the stem cells of sperm, if you will, known as spermatogonia. They are 46 chromosomes. Spermatogonia begin to go through meiosis, and usually the spermatogonia, you can see a nucleus in them. Then the next layer has a bunch of squiggle lines inside because the nucleus has been unwrapped and the chromosomes are all out there and they're all stringy. Those are known as primary spermatocytes. And they still also have 46 chromosomes. Then they further divide, but visually, we're not really seeing much of a difference. We just know they're a little bit closer to the inside. So if we say this is the inner lumen, we're just coming closer to that. These are secondary spermatocytes. Excuse me. And these guys are 23 chromosomes. They're really half of a cell at this point. Now we've achieved the half of a cell status. And now it's time to coil up all those loose stringy things and start to package them back up. So then we have these spermatids that are a little smaller. Make sure this one's bigger. So they're a little smaller, but you're going to start to see a dense nucleus, a more back to solid black nucleus. That's also going to be 23 chromosomes. And then it condenses even further to be really tiny, and then it's going to sprout a tail, and those are going to be spermatozoa. Or sperm for short. And there's going to be loads of them. And then they're going to detach from the wall and start their little migratory process and pathway through the rest of the seminiferous tubules. Within the seminiferous tubules are another cell here, I'm going to draw it in blue. They do not become sperm, but they contribute to the sperm making process and provide nourishment, and they're known as Sertoli cells. And they do, and it kind of goes without saying, except for since we are identifying chromosomes, we will indicate they do have 46 chromosomes. It's just like a normal cell. The only ones that have 23 are these guys, just because they're undergoing meiosis. The Leydig cells out here also would have 46 chromosomes because they're also a normal cell. So if we're following hormones from the anterior pituitary, luteinizing hormone is what targeted the interstitial cells or Leydig cells to make testosterone. But follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary is going to target the spermatogonia to tell them start the sperm making process. So that's actually going to initiate the formation of the gamete, where luteinizing hormone forms the sex hormone for the whatever gender we're talking about, obviously male in this case. Does that make sense as far as sperm formation? Once we form sperm, then we go from the testes through the seminiferous tubules within the testes into the epididymis. It's a whole nother tubular network that's on the outside and wraps around the testis itself till it goes to the bottom of the testis. At the very bottom, it makes a U-turn, and now it's called the vas deferens or ductus deferens. And it's that vas deferens or ductus deferens that goes up into the body. So from the testes, the vas deferens or ductus deferens is coming up into the body. It goes through the spermatic cord. So it's one thing in the spermatic cord. So sometimes people think it's the same thing. The spermatic cord is all the stuff that's really connecting the testes to the body under the scrotal skin. So you have arteries, veins, nerves, lymphatic vessels, as well as the vas deferens and ductus. That's all in that spermatic cord. The ductus deferens or vas deferens comes up into the torso. It comes kind of out to wide, and then it kind of comes towards the middle and behind the bladder, and it rests on the back side of the bladder, and the end of the vas deferens is known as the ampulla, and that's really the excuse me, the holding tank for the sperm as it's waiting for its release. So it can sit there for several months. If it's sort of not released from the body after a few months, it will actually just get reabsorbed. And so it just sits there and nothing happens. But the sperm are inert. They're not the ones that are moving. That's why there's so much smooth muscle, because we don't want the sperm with the tail, and you should know sperm anatomy, with the tail, midpiece, head with the chromosomes, and then the acrosome. You want to move, because if it's moving, it actually could create free radical byproducts that could cause damage to this very exposed nucleus with the chromosomes right there. So it stays inert. That's why there's so much smooth muscle that's actually moving the sperm along. It is only at the point of ejaculation where the sperm combines with the seminal fluid that these become activated. And so that's why sperm can be short-lived. The long-living sperm would be like if you have super sperm, we're looking at five days. But normal sperm, we're looking at, 3 days-ish, 1 to 3 days perhaps. Which is also why I mentioned when we were talking about fertility as far as females go, sometimes females that are waiting till they ovulate to then have sex or sperm delivery, if you want to think of it that anatomical way, to have their sperm delivery at the point that they're ovulating, it may be too late because the egg is only viable for 24 hours. And because of a longer lifespan for sperm, if somebody's either trying to get pregnant or avoid being pregnant, it is up to 5 days prior to ovulation. That would be the most dangerous or opportune time, depending on your perspective as far as sex goes. So there's that. We did sperm migration pathway. So once it gets the ampulla, who can tell me the next duct that it goes into? Because now it's on its way out. Ejaculatory duct. It's within the prostate. There's two sides. We have the two ampullas, so I'm like sort of motioning on the back of this bladder, and then the prostate's below it. So once it hangs out from the ampulla, it's diving into the prostate, sort of one from each side, so it kind of comes at an angle. So sometimes the diagrams are a bit misleading, so it almost looks like there's one prostatic urethra and one ejaculatory duct, but there's actually two coming at an angle from either side to meet up with the prostatic urethra, and then out across the membranous urethra, and then out across the penile or spongy urethra. So that's the pathway. Now along the pathway, let's throw in semen formation in the glands. The 3 glands you need to know are going to be the bulb urethral glands, also known as the Cowpers. They're a paired set of glands at the base of the penis. They're first to secrete their secretions upon early arousal. They're sort of sending out their fluid that's going to neutralize anything going on within the urethra. It's going to cause some lubrication. It's just the jump starter. Then the actual point of ejaculation, the primary component, the main component is going to be from the seminal vesicles. Those are a paired set of glands that sit next to the ampulla on the back side of the bladder. So the ampulla is where the sperm's hanging out, that sperm holding tank. Next to the holding tank on each one, so there's two of them, is going to be the seminal vesicles. So at the point of ejaculation, the sperm from the ampulla are going to be delivered into the ejaculatory duct. At the same time, the fluid from the seminal vesicles get delivered into the ejaculatory duct. Then, while it's going through the ejaculatory duct, that's the prostate. Then the prostate's going to add its stuff too. The seminal vesicles add things like glucose or fructose and other things that's going to actually increase the activity of the sperm, sort of like get their motor going so they can propel themselves. The prostate is going to provide prostaglandins, but so does seminal vesicles, that's going to help the sperm be protected in the female reproductive system. It's going to be really alkaline because the female reproductive system is very acidic. If you guys remember from the video, you got the sperm like dying, like they were withering away like it was on the Wizard of Oz, you know, getting water thrown on them like it was the witch or something. But that's like the acidity of the vaginal canal. So the prostates will make an alkaline substance that's actually going to neutralize it, kind of put sperm in a little happy buffer, bring it in there so the female reproductive tract doesn't break it down and offend it. And then also hormones, prostaglandins, are like little local hormones that's going to cause the cervix to dilate and be a little less obstructive. Okay, penis anatomy, you should know, obviously, the penile or spongy urethra is coming out. The erectile tissue right around the urethra itself is known as corpora spongiosum, which is why that part of the penile urethra is also known as the spongy urethra. Either way. The other two strands along the length of the penis, that is the erectile tissue, is corpora cavernosa. They are on the dorsal surface. Those are the primary ones that cause erection. What happens with an erection is upon arousal, you have that increase of blood pressure in, but because of some of the structures within there, there's actually a tunica albuginea in the penis too, as well as the testes. It's a different one though, obviously. The greater pressure going in causes an obstruction for the venous flow going out. And so therefore, you got a lot of pressure coming in and you're not draining that pressure off, and that's the basis of an erection. The fundamental components of that really have to do with nitric oxide, and that's the whole mechanism behind Viagra. Like I said, Viagra started off being a heart medication until they found this happy side effect for people. So then they said, we can make a lot more money selling it as this other thing rather than the heart side of things. So anyways, even though heart medications make a lot of money too, nothing like, you know, targeting that. So that was where it came from. And that's also one of the reasons why nitric oxide was molecule of the year in like, what was it? 1992 or in the 90s. It was like, you know how Time magazine does like a man of the year, person of the year. They had molecule of the year, and that was nitric oxide. Hormone regulation of sperm cells and testosterone. I already did it. Follicle stimulating hormone forms sperm. Luteinizing hormone forms testosterone. Okay, any questions on the male? Female anatomy, we'll deal with the ovaries. The ovary anatomy, there's no anatomy of the ovary, just the ovary. There's no other parts of the ovary. We're going to talk about the follicles inside the ovary. Ligaments and functions. I think I meant to have a comma there, ovary, and then your basic anatomy. So we have the basic anatomy of the whole female tract. Obviously, we'll go from the bottom up. We go from the vagina, that's the outside, you go in, and then you go cervix, which is going to be the bottom of the uterus. So then we have the uterus, we have the cervix, the body, and the fundus, which is the top round part. The fundus is actually what was going to protrude out above the symphysis pubis when a female gets pregnant, and you can feel that growing. So you're going to palpate the fundus of the uterus, so it's going to be the top rounded part. From there, out comes these fallopian tubes or uterine tubes. The corner is the ampulla, which is the site of the fertilization that takes place most of the time. Then you have the infundibulum with the fimbriae right at the ends. And the fimbriae are these little finger-like projections that's going to kind of surround but not touch the ovary. Then there's the ovary. And at the point or at the time of ovulation, the fimbriae start to undulate and actually kind of cup down and get closer to the ovary itself. Otherwise, it kind of sits out. So there is actually some inherent movement going on at that time. Then you have the ovary. You have ligaments that hold all these things in place because they're sort of suspended in the middle of the pelvic cavity. One's a male and one's a female. The female has a broken pelvis here. So I try not to rotate them because it grinds on the bones, but I'm going to tip them up a little bit so you can kind of see, well, hopefully I'll tip it here. The female pelvis has a wider angle. That's how you can tell it's a female compared to the male. It's just more narrow. That's going to be the most obvious way you can sex them. The other is if I'm going to tip it forward and you look straight down, you know, the sacrum here in the back, outside of the ossa coxa or inside the ossa coxa, the male sacrum is really curved in, so the coccyx is really tucked in more, versus the female sacrum is more shallow. Obviously, if somebody's coming out, we'll poke them in the eye with the male sacrum versus, or it depends which way they're going. So I'll tip it down so you can see a wider pelvic basin, but more importantly, the shape of the sacrum and the curvature of the sacrum. So we have within the female, the uterus and the fallopian tube, everything's sort of in the middle. So we have to have these ligaments to tether it and suspend it so it can stay there in the middle so it's not kind of flopping around. So those ligaments are from the, let's see, hold this up here. So from the uterus to the front is going to be the round ligaments. From the uterus to the back is going to be the uterosacral ligaments. Then the uterus to the side are going to be the suspensory ligaments. The suspensory ligaments have the added feature of having the artery and vein coming and going from there, but they're coming out from the side. And then the only other one I have you know is the ovarian ligament, which connects the ovary medially into the uterus. Oh, the very last one, sorry, is the broad ligament. So it's a flat, thin ligament that actually laminates all of this stuff in together. We saw that in the uterus in a bucket that I have. As far as the meiosis goes, within an ovary, ovary here, we start off with the early follicles that all females get by the time they are an embryo. And these are known as primordial follicles. And there's thousands of them out around in the periphery. And they are in a halted state of meiosis. Meiosis is not completed. And so it is only upon puberty and hormonal stimulation, particularly follicle stimulating hormone, is going to kick in and say, let's get a batch of eggs going. So about 10-ish come out of this primordial follicle state. To become a primary follicle. And the primary follicles will be the same little egg, but they're going to have cells around the outside, cuboidal cells. And then those cuboidal cells start to enlarge and detach and actually move away from the egg, where the egg stays anchored on one side, and you start to get some fluid filled in there, and that's known as a secondary follicle. So then that becomes the little egg with the dots around it, and then you have follicle, and then that just grows more. It's just sort of the same thing but bigger into a mature follicle, also known as a Graafian follicle. And then that gets even, cells around it are even bigger. There's more fluid, but then the egg is still anchored off to, one side. So that all of this follicular development takes several weeks. In a, say, 54-day cycle for a female, so if she has a period every 54 days, it's a long time, this is going to take 40 days to happen. In a normal average 28-day cycle, it's going to take 14 days. So this duration, this follicular phase is what this process is called, the duration of this. The time frame is variable, but it's usually 2 weeks. But it is the most variable time. So if a female's period duration changes, not the duration of the menstruation part, but the cycle length changes, it is this follicular phase and its corresponding proliferative phase that's going to be the most variable stages. So once you create this, you're developing a follicle. I'm just going to make the egg, well, no, it's blue. Add here. I will put follicle stimulating hormone is going to initiate this process. That's why it's called that, follicle stimulating these follicle developments. At the point of ovulation, this egg gets propelled out. It has its cells outside. Draw this fimbriae. Here's a fallopian tube. Comes on over here. So we have the egg on its way. Now that there is no egg within the mature follicle ejected the egg. So we have this event. I'm just going to write ovulation. Sort of just one moment in time where the egg gets ejected out. It is after that point in time that the remaining follicular cells increase in size. I'm just drawing it as a circle because I don't feel like drawing the cells, but there are a whole bunch of cells and they get really, really big and they enlarge and they become the corpus luteum. And this corpus luteum is known as, this phase here is known as the luteal phase. And it will always be 14 days. So this is constant. It's not going to vary, this one at all. That's why if there's any change in cycle length, it's always going to be on this front side. But once the ovulation takes place, that's a pretty set pattern right there. Corpus luteum, what is its job? What does it do? It releases progesterone. So it's making progesterone. And it lasts for 14 days. After 14 days, it just shrivels up, dies, and no more progesterone. And then we're done with progesterone. The hormone levels drop to nil. And then that's the signal. Pituitary gland says, let's send out some more follicle stimulating hormone and let's start this cycle over again. And that's what's going on in the ovary. So follicle stimulating, we develop a follicle, we eject it, we send out progesterone for about 2 weeks, nothing happens, goes away, follicle stimulating hormone starts the next batch. So that's what's going on at that level of the ovary. Then we have to add a whole layer of complication because now I have to talk about what's going on in the uterus. Because not only is the female the site of creating a gamete, But then we have to talk about the potential housing of a fertilized egg and the subsequent development of that. I'm going to shorten up this fallopian tube. I have more room here, I guess not. We have a really big ovary or uterus here. This is our little internal os. This is our vagina down here. We have a myometrium, that's the thick wall part of the uterus. We have the serous coat, which is on the outside, the thickest wall. And the uterus, this is actually really mushed together. So there's really, it's kind of more smashed together. I'm just sort of drawing it open so we can have more room to draw the egg coming in. But really, it's not gapped open. It's kind of snugged in there. We have a endometrial lining here in red. So the process that we're going to go through as far as the uterus is we begin when the primordial follicles are being made here, and it's the start of a cycle, we begin the uterine cycle in the menstrual phase. And that's where the lining is just breaking apart and exiting. It's going away while there's a whole new egg being made. Then immediately after, if the woman had a lot of estrogen and had built up a pretty hefty lining, their periods tend to last longer. A woman has a shorter period, has a little less estrogen. It's, again, all about proportions, but because estrogen is the growth promoter hormone, women that have more estrogen is going to build a thicker lining. Thicker lining isn't always good. It's sort of not like the thickest one is the winner. It's not like a contest or anything, but you want to have enough estrogen to build a lining. The more important thing is the progesterone is, okay, whatever lining you make, how well can you secrete the glands? This is what's going to, so you're going to make enough, but some women can have a very, very thick developed lining. So again, that takes longer to get rid of. So that's the variation in the actual menstrual phase. So that can vary. Then once you strip it down until you're just a few bare level cells there, we start the next phase, the proliferative. And now we're building up a new endometrial lining. It's growing thicker. It's actually creating glands, but the glands are not operational. It's sort of just getting installed. You want to think about it that way. We have glands that are installed, a line that's getting thicker. This is a proliferative phase. So everything that's red over here, the menstrual phase and proliferative phase, matches everything in blue that's over here. So while the egg is going through all these follicles, the endometrium we got rid of it, and then we rebuilt it. So this here, so these are the phases corresponding with that. Then I'll write the ovulation event over here. Ovulation, again, is a single event in time. The egg is on its way. We have now progesterone coming into the house here. Progesterone is going to this endometrial lining, and progesterone is making the glands secrete the glycogen substances so that it has energy in case a fertilized egg does implant. So now it's ready. It's really, it's sort of like having a kitchen installed. It's one thing to have the stove installed. The other thing is it's actually cooking and making stuff, and it's actually useful. So that's why we have the 2 weeks. So the 2 weeks, we're waiting for this egg to come in and get implanted if it's fertilized. So this phase, this color is going to match that other core. The luteal phase is going to match the endometrium's secretory phase. And that lasts only 2 weeks. And so how this wraps up is you've got 2 weeks, egg comes along, egg doesn't get fertilized, egg just sort of tumbles on its way out. We have 2 weeks with this corpus luteum, it goes away, done. As soon as that progesterone level drops, then that's what causes this to crumble apart. And then when the progesterone dropped, send out follicle stimulating hormones. So we started a new follicle. We also got rid of the old. So that's how the 2 cycles are going together. You should know it in this way, obviously knowing that the luteal phase in the ovary corresponds with the secretory phase in the endometrium, or the follicular phase there matches these two. So you should know what phases correspond with each other, but then be able to do the timing of that on, like I mentioned, there's going to be a page in their test where there's actually a calendar saying, this is the first day of menstruation, which would be the start here. You can also count it as a start here. Hey, here's a calendar, you know, April 3rd is going to be the first day of menstruation, and the person has 28-day cycle length. That makes it easy because there's just 4 basic weeks. What day would that person ovulate? So you just like look at the calendar and you go down 4 weeks and you back it up 2 weeks, because that would be the ovulation day. So I want you to be able to translate that onto a calendar as well as just verbally. I might say, here's the calendar. This is the day of the first day of the period. What weeks would you expect estrogen to be high? Here, when do we expect estrogen to be high? What phases? Yes, so estrogen helps the proliferative phase. It helps the rebuilding. So just to match it over here, so we would really have estrogen over here. I skipped the first week because the first week is just really low hormones. It's like low, but they're starting to rise up. So it's really the second week that we really see a significant amount of estrogen in, because we're stimulating the growth of the endometrium, and then after that time we have progesterone. Genitalia, we have the clitoris, which is the anterior portion. We have the 2 labia. There's a labia minora, which is the smaller one, and the outer genitalia is primarily the labia majora. The 2 labia come together at the point of the clitoris, where that is actually made of erectile tissue that is analogous to the same erectile tissue in males. So we all have the same basic building blocks. They're obviously put together differently. Vestibule is the space in there, so it's not identifying a feature, it's just the space within the boundaries of the labia. You have a number of glands. You have the urethra coming out, you have the vagina coming out. There are glands within there, not only glands to protect the female reproductive tract from bacteria and creating an acidic environment, but obviously lubricating glands. And then you have the rectum beyond that. I think that's it for that. The mammary gland, you should know that we have glands as well as ducts. Prolactin stimulates the glands to make milk. Oxytocin stimulates the ducts, the smooth muscle, to deliver the milk to the nipple and to the lactiferous sinuses, which is actually the ducts right behind the nipple. It's kind of hanging on to the milk there. We talked about the ovarian phases in the calendar. I think that covers everything. Okay, so I'm going to leave this so we have the egg on the way, because that's the whole point of fertilization. The egg's on the way, we have progesterone, we have well, let's not put the X's here. We have a really good endometrium that's ready to roll and not fall apart. There we go. Okay. So fertilization usually takes place, this is a really bad fallopian tube. So it's usually the corner known as the ampulla. That's where fertilization, sperm's gonna show up. The sperm, anatomy of the sperm is that you have the acrosome on the tip that's gonna penetrate the corona radiata, it just swims through that, but then it actually will penetrate through the zona pellucida. Once it penetrates the zona pellucida, it gets into the egg and fertilizes it, and then the egg completes its meiosis. You also should know, and I didn't mention this at this review, when the egg is ovulated, it's still in metaphase 2. So we didn't go through all the steps of meiosis, but meiosis basically has a step 1 and step 2 grouping of steps. And so it's in this secondary grouping, but it's in metaphase 2 is the state. And it won't complete meiosis until the sperm penetrates the egg. And then it will finish its meiosis and then align those chromosomes and things happen. So then it's a zygote, your zygote. Then immediately cleavage starts to take place. And cleavage, we know, is cell dividing. And then it divides, and there's this like dense ball of cells after a couple of days, and that's a morolla. So we have the morolla after about 3 days, about midway down. And then we finally end up as a blastocyst. And the blastocyst is just as it's tumbling into the uterine cavity itself. The blastocyst, you need to know the parts of the blastocyst. It's going to have a trophoblast and an embryoblast. So it has the outer shell is a trophoblast, and the inner part is the embryoblast. That is what gets implanted in here. So it literally looks like a follicle again, but it's way bigger and it's not the follicle. So it embeds inside the endometrial lining. The trophoblast, once it embeds in the endometrial lining, sends out human chorionic gonadotropin, which tells the corpus luteum, continue secretions. Do not stop after 14 days. Just keep going. And progesterone will continue to be secreted and the endometrium will stay intact. That allows time. This happens for about 3 months. So it allows time for this developing trophoblast, which is actually going to be the placenta and all the outer structures. The embryoblast is actually going to be the baby itself eventually. So that's going to persist for about 3 months until the components of the trophoblast created, meaning the placenta, can continue its own progesterone secretions. And then the mom's ovary isn't needed anymore from that point. You should know this embryoblast will have its germ layers. It has the ectoderm, which is going to be the top. That's going to be the brain, and that's the most important one that we care about at this point. There is mesoderm. That's going to be your muscles and your skeletal system. And then there's going to be the endoderm. And that's going to be your intestines and your guts and some other organs. The ectoderm is going to be the brain. It has its neural tube development, and the most important time that it has to have folic acid is at the 3-week stage. At 3 weeks, it needs it after that as well, but this is where it really needs it quite badly. Need folic acid. 3 to 5 weeks. So you should know kind of each one what they're going to eventually make. You should definitely know that. This 3-week stage, I will only stick with on the test the gestational age. So this is 3 weeks from the time of fertilization, not the clinical term. So the clinical weeks would be 5 weeks because they add 2 weeks to everything. The extra embryonic membranes, once we got these endoderms, mesoderms, the embryo's developing, you have a yolk sac that sticks out. It does some primitive digestive functions, some blood functions. We have an allantosis, which is a stalk connecting it down to the chorion, and which is going to be the baby side of the placenta and the mom side of the placenta. Mom side is really the placenta, that's the vascular side. And then the embryo itself is surrounded by, directly around it is its own amniotic sac. So however many embryos a female gets put in there, whether she's octomom or she's just got one kid in there, each embryo is going to have its own amniotic sac. Now, if it's an identical twin in there, so you got 2 little guys in there, both of them will have an amniotic sac, but the identical twins will share a placenta and a chorion. If they're fraternal twins, they'll both have their own amnions and their own placentas because they're going to be 2 completely different cell sets. So there's that as far as the extra embryonic membranes. The placenta, the structure, just know the vascular side faces mom. There's no blood mixing. They just go next to each other so you can exchange that way. The placenta is going to make a lot of progesterone. It's going to make estrogen. It's going to make relaxin. That's actually going to cause the female pelvis to widen, the ligaments to stretch out, widen even more to open up the birth canal. The anatomy of the umbilical cord is that we have 2 umbilical arteries going out, or the baby does, and a single umbilical vein coming back in. And then that's going to come into the belly button and then to the liver. Mom's going to filter the baby is going to filter anything that was picked up from the mom's side from placenta. So that's why it goes to the liver first before it's released to the systemic circulation of the fetus. And there are benchmarks. So it's probably the next part. So the next part is really just fetal development, and there are benchmarks in the fetal development. I really don't have that many questions. There are a couple more along the lines of when can you see a skeleton? That would be 16 weeks. 12 weeks is when the ossification actually begins. So the bones are cartilage up until that point, and then the ossification or the calcification of bones starts at about 12 weeks, but you actually have mini X-ray, like a mini skeleton if you saw it on X-ray at 16 weeks. At 11 weeks is where you can identify whether it's a male or female visually on ultrasound. The 3 to 5 weeks, 3 weeks is where we initiate the formation of the brain, the neural tube formation. So that 3 to 5 weeks are the most important for brain development, only because it's laying the foundations of the brain. Brain development is really important after that as well, but it's growing and differentiating what's already been put in place. So it's really the underlying foundation. That's why that's so important. And that's why folic acid is so important at that time, because if you're not sealing up that neural tube, you're going to have a birth defect that can't be remedied later. And the majority, so the way the test is set up is, I don't have the exact test number, but roughly, I would say you can sort of estimate percentage-wise, say 40% kidney, like renal, urinary, nephron, all of that, 40% reproductive, male anatomy, female anatomy, ovary stuff, uterus stuff, seminiferous tubules, all that. In their sort of histology, I should throw in, you will need to know the histology of a seminiferous tubule, you'll need to know the histology of an ovary, and you should know the histology of the uterine phases, what it looks like for the menstrual phase, what a proliferative phase looks like, and what a secretory phase. So you will need to see those. So that would be, so we're looking at 40% on the reproductive anatomy, and then, so that puts us 80% between those 2 big chapters. So then the other 20% is like about 10% on the fluid acid base, and another 10% on this development component. So that way they're just sort of icing on the cake for their sort of larger chapters that go with it to help kind of bring together some of those concepts. So that's sort of the emphasis if you want to. The uterus. So you have the 3 phases of the uterus, the menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and secretory phase. You should also know the basic anatomy of reproductive anatomy. So I'm thinking like on your practical exam, you should definitely expect to see one of those, sagittal section, here's a male, here's a female, here's the, ejaculatory duct, or here's the vas deferens, or here's a fallopian tube, fimbriae, those kind of things that you're just visually looking at those. So you want to look at your basic anatomy. Taking that. Kidney, you should know your kidney anatomy. It might be like a kidney diagram. You should know pathway of vessels. And then you should know about, the hormones. I might ask about follicle stimulating hormone. In both males and females, the follicle stimulating hormone is going to make the gamete. So it's going to make the egg or the sperm. It's going to stimulate that process. Where it's the luteinizing hormone that's going to actually target the cells of the female, and I didn't mention this, the female cells that are in the early follicle stage. Draw that. So we had the egg, little dots. And so if this was our follicle stage before ovulation, it is these cells out here, they're known as thecal cells, that are going to make the estrogen. It's actually where estrogen comes from. That's the luteinizing hormone contribution. Where in the males, luteinizing hormone is going to go to the Leydig cells and make testosterone. So that's the story there. There's just a different set of cells that rim this that become the corpus luteum. So sort of like a double. double set here.